Right, so the PFL have bought Bellator. I just wanted to get this video out quickly because I've been mulling over this idea just in case that it would happen, but we got a lot to do today. I got a lot to do today. So I'm just gonna give my initial thoughts on this, but I think it's a pretty interesting lay of the land. I got three main takeaways from the PFL fighting Bellator, so I'm just gonna get straight into it. The first one is that this deal is going to be worse for the fighters. The second one is that this is going to be better for MMA fans overall. And the third is that this is going to be just business as usual in the industry because we've always had an A league and a B league. So first of all, why is this going to be worse for the fighters? Look, the price that the fighters get paid is called the market value, and it's what they're worth when it comes to the competitive MMA leagues that want to buy their services, and their services are being an MMA fighter. The way that business and competition works is that the more competitive services that there are around, the more bidding the fighters can do as they go to each competitive service. Sort of picture this as Bellator, PFL, One Championship, UFC, and you're a fighter. Now, if there are many different options up here, a fighter can bounce around between the different services and negotiate back and forth and keep raising their prices. As one of these services eats up the other one, that's less options for the fighter to go to, which means if this service here, if service A or PFL, go away birds, if service A or PFL consume service B, Bellator, and now that is just one service, they are now saying we're not going higher than this number, and the fighter has got less options to bounce around to. I hope that makes sense. Let me know down in the comments if I haven't explained that clearly. So essentially, with brands buying other brands and scooping up services, that is worse for the fighters. However, it's better for the fans because when you've got all these different MMA services up here, PFL, Bellator, UFC, One Championship, it's much harder for the fans to follow the league. So the more that these come together and the more that you do have monopolies, it's easier for us, the fan. This is what has ruined boxing. The services of boxing essentially broke down to where every single fighter thought they were their own promoter, and boxing cards never got done. Things never happened. The reason that the UFC can have Charles Oliveira drop out and then literally the next week Alexander Volkanovski step in is because they have so many fighters. It's better for us, the fans. That's why I've always argued it's better to have a strong UFC. So PFL buying Bellator just means that there's more good fighters under a single company umbrella. Better for the fans, worse for the fighters. They can't fight over a market value. We only have to follow one league. Now, how is this going to be business as usual for the industry? Look, PFL have been a disruptor, but they've only been as a disruptor since 2017. Before that, it was literally pretty much. I mean, from about 2014, 2016 to 2017, maybe 2012 to 2017, it was essentially just the UFC and Bellator. They were the two main names to watch in the MMA space. And Bellator was always known as the B leagues. And then PFL came along and started to grow, and now that's sort of known as the C league. So the PFL have gone ahead and bought Bellator. Now it's just back to business as usual, the way things used to be forever in MMA. The UFC is still the premium MMA organization. It's the one that the kids grow up watching, and if the kids grow up watching the UFC, they want to get into the UFC, and that way the UFC can keep hoarding the talent. And the UFC, don't forget, if the UFC really wanted to crush the PFL and Bellator, if they were really worried about it, they could outbid them relentlessly, take a loss for 2 or 3 years on their fighter contracts, and just destroy the PFL and Bellator. But they don't want to do that because they're not really a threat. And quite frankly, it's good to have a B league. It's good to have other options. It's good to have more names in the industry to bounce ideas off. What the UFC essentially does is let the PFL try these crazy ideas, or let Bellator try different ideas and try different fighters. Essentially, there's always going to be an A side and a B side, and now the B side and the C side have just combined, and it's just back to having an A side and a B side. How is this deal of the PFL going to go? So what the PFL have explained to us is that they are going to have their regular season, and then outside of their regular season, they're going to have these Bellator not pay-per-view super fights, not super fights, just interesting matchups. It's just the same fighters under one umbrella, pretty much having what we have now. It's really not that different. You're going to have young up-and-coming fighters fighting for that big $1 million paycheck in the PFL regular season. And the exact example that the PFL's owner used is that fighters like Anthony Pettis are simply too old to compete in a season-long battle. So all you're going to have is fighters coming up in the PFL, trying their hand, going into the top 3 of that championship run, maybe only doing it 1 or 2 seasons in a row, and then their bodies are just going to start to break down and they're going to pop over to Bellator and fight 2 times a year in the 8 pay-per-view, not pay-per-view cards that the Bellator is going to put on. It sounds convoluted, doesn't it? But all you need to do is picture young up-and-coming fighters fighting in the PFL regular season. Once their bodies start to age out, Anthony Pettis-esque, they will move over to Bellator, and Bellator are just going to have these old dogs fighting each other every now and then. And then whenever the PFL brand can get someone like Jake Paul, Francis Ngannou, they're yapping at Nate Diaz's heels super hard. Whenever they have a decent name that can sell some pay-per-views, they will put on a pay-per-view outside of all that. So you're essentially going to have a 3-tier system at the PFL. I do think eventually, long-term, that will break down because that is too confusing for the regular consumer to keep up with over an entire year. It's very similar to how Marvel just used to put out 3 movies a year and it built up to Endgame and everyone loved it. And then the second they did that, they started releasing 10 movies a year across Disney Plus and TV shows as well. And everyone's just a little bit like, no, why do we care about all of this? We want a simple packaged consumable product. That's how you sell the most tickets to the widest audience. So this PFL idea of we're going to have pay-per-views, we're going to have the regular season, then we're going to have the old dogs fighting each other in Bellator, that is not going to last. All we're going to end up with in about less than 5 years' time is we're going to have the PFL, which is going to be a very competitive B league to the UFC, just how things used to be back in 2015, except the name's now PFL instead of Bellator. Great news for everyone in MMA. I think it's fun to watch. I think the PFL regular season is fun to watch while it's here. I don't think the Bellator brand is going to last. No one's going to want to watch eight cards of old fighters fighting each other. No one's going to want to watch that over a 5-year period. That's just going to slowly decline. And as for the PFL pay-per-views, it just depends on what names they can get. If they can keep getting lucky, like grabbing Jake Paul, Francis Ngannou, if they can snatch Nate Diaz, then they will continue on. If they can't, they won't. It's as simple as that. Let me know what you think down in the comments of this PFL Bellator merger. I hope you guys have been enjoying these videos. If you have, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button down there. And I'll see you all in the next one.